April 3, 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Reims, France. A thin packet of reports lay on the table. The maps showed broken German lines. The arrows pointed east. One arrow was moving faster than all the others. It belonged to Patton. The reports were clear. His armored columns were cutting through central Germany. Resistance was collapsing. Bridges were falling intact. Prisoners were flooding west. The road to Berlin was no longer theoretical. Inside the room, the silence was heavier than the paper. Dwight D. Eisenhower read without speaking. The war in the West was almost over. That was what the reports said. But something else was forming in the quiet. A decision that would not be written as an order at first. A pause, a delay, a limit. Patton would not be allowed to go any further. No announcement was made. No public explanation was given. But from that moment, the direction of the war changed. At the front, George S. Patton did not know this yet. His Third Army was moving faster than any Allied force in Europe. Supply lines were stretched but holding. German units were surrendering by the thousands. Cities fell without a fight. The enemy was no longer planning counterattacks. It was trying to escape. To Patton, the situation was simple. Speed mattered more than order. Momentum mattered more than symmetry. Berlin was not a symbol. It was a target. Whoever took it decided the ending. Patton's staff officers saw the same thing. German defenses ahead were thin. Soviet forces were still far to the east. The race was real, and it could be won. Patton sent messages upward. He did not ask permission in the language of caution. He framed it as an opportunity. Delay, he warned, would cost lives later. Delay would create problems that could not be fixed. The messages moved up the chain. At Supreme Headquarters, they slowed down. Eisenhower did not doubt Patton's assessment of the battlefield. He doubted the battlefield itself, or more precisely, he doubted that the battlefield was the only thing that mattered anymore. By April 1945, Germany was already defeated in practical terms. What remained was not conquest, but settlement, borders, influence, control. The war was ending, but another structure was being built inside it. Eisenhower understood this. The agreements made months earlier were now shaping the map more than tank columns. At Yalta, lines had been drawn in language, not ink. Zones of occupation had been agreed upon. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone. Taking it would not change that fact. From Eisenhower's perspective, racing east created new risks. It risked collision with Soviet forces. It risked a political crisis at the moment of victory. It risked breaking an alliance that had not yet finished its job. The enemy was no longer only Germany. It was instability. The logic was clean. The reasoning was defensible. But it required stopping the fastest army in Europe. Patton sensed the resistance before it was spoken openly. Orders became vague. Objectives shifted south. Emphasis moved to clearing pockets instead of advancing lines. The Third Army was told to pivot. Patton reacted with controlled anger. He did not explode. He recorded. He wrote. He complained privately. He warned that the Soviets were not partners, but future adversaries. He believed that delay would not preserve peace. It would transfer power. These warnings were noted. They were not acted upon. Eisenhower's command style had always favored unity over individuality. Coalition warfare required balance. British concerns had to be respected. Soviet expectations had to be managed. American generals could not appear independent. Patton was the opposite of balance. He was effective, but unpredictable. Victorious, but politically dangerous. His public statements were already causing concern. His view of the Soviets was blunt and unfiltered. To Eisenhower, allowing Patton to seize Berlin was not only a military decision, it was a political signal, one that could be read as provocation. So Eisenhower chose restraint. He informed his commanders that Berlin was no longer a priority. The main effort would shift south toward Bavaria and Austria. The official reason was sound: preventing a German Alpine redoubt, securing territory, ending the war cleanly. The unofficial result was silence. Patton was no longer the spear aimed at the capital. He was a tool redirected away from it. On the German side, this pause was noticed. In the final weeks of the war, German commanders were no longer planning victory. They were planning survival. They watched Allied movements carefully. Every shift mattered. The sudden slowing of the American advance toward Berlin created confusion. Some believed it was temporary. Others began to suspect it was permanent. German officers understood something important. If the Americans stopped, the Soviets would arrive alone. For many Germans, this was the worst outcome. Entire units began to move west, not to fight, but to surrender. They avoided the Red Army at all costs. They gambled that American captivity would be more predictable. The pause accelerated this movement. The battlefield changed character. It was no longer about resistance. It was about positioning before the collapse. Patton watched this unfold with frustration. His tanks idled. His officers argued about logistics and permissions. The momentum bled away. He believed the moment was being wasted. Eisenhower, meanwhile, received confirmation that the Soviets were advancing rapidly. Zhukov was pushing toward the Oder. Konev was driving hard from the south. The Red Army was paying in blood, but it was moving. The race was effectively over. This was not said publicly, but the internal understanding was clear. Berlin would fall to the Soviets. Eisenhower accepted this as the price of the alliance. To him, the war was not about who arrived first. It was about how it ended. A clean conclusion. No Allied clashes. No political fractures before surrender. The decision held. On April 12th, Roosevelt died. The political center shifted again. Truman inherited a war already shaped by decisions he had not made. The pressure to maintain unity increased. Patton was informed more directly now. His axis would not change. Berlin was off the table. He complied. Publicly. Privately, he recorded his belief that the future was being handed away. That the pause would not be remembered as wisdom, but as a surrender of leverage. At the front, American soldiers felt the change without understanding it. The enemy was broken. The road ahead was open, but the order was to stop, regroup, and wait. The war slowed down where it could have ended faster. The Soviet advance did not slow. As April turned into late April, the sounds from the east changed. Artillery grew heavier. Smoke rose over Berlin. The city was surrounded. When it fell violently, street by street, building by building. The cost was immense. Eisenhower knew this. He also knew the changing course now would not change the political outcome, only the casualty list. The silence held. Patton watched the news come in. Berlin was encircled, then assaulted, then taken. The war in Europe ended soon after. On paper, the alliance stood. But something else ended quietly. The moment when battlefield momentum could shape the post-war world had passed. The pause before Berlin was not a failure of command. It was a choice. A choice to favor political order over military speed, to trust agreements over instincts, to preserve an alliance even as its future cracks formed. The cost of that choice was not paid in April 1945. It was paid later. May 1945 did not bring relief. It brought rearrangement. Germany signed the surrender. The guns fell silent. The maps changed color, and the consequences of April settled into place. Berlin lay in ruins. Soviet flags flew over the Reichstag. The city was no longer a prize. It was a statement. For the Red Army, the capture was not just military. It was symbolic dominance. They had paid for it with staggering losses, and they intended to collect what they believed they had earned. For the Western Allies, the result was accepted quietly. There was no protest, no revision. The agreements were honored. But trust did not survive the moment. Inside Allied headquarters, the tone changed. Conversations shifted from coordination to calculation, from shared victory to managed coexistence. The alliance remained intact on paper. In practice, distance appeared. Eisenhower's decision now looked settled. Berlin was behind the lines. The war was over. The logic still stood. But Patton did not let the matter rest. He traveled through occupied Germany and Eastern Europe. He observed Soviet behavior closely. He noted how territory was administered, how German officials were removed, how political structures were replaced. What he saw confirmed his fears. The Red Army was not preparing to leave. It was preparing to stay. Patton spoke openly about it to his staff. He described Soviet actions as expansion, not security. He warned that the pause before Berlin was not neutral. It was decisive. These views spread quietly through the officer corps. They were not shared by Eisenhower. Eisenhower's priority was stability. The United States had to demobilize. Europe had to not collapse. Another war had to be avoided at all costs. Challenging Soviet control now would have required confrontation. That confrontation would have required troops, American troops. The public would not have accepted it. The choice made in April had locked in these constraints. As the summer progressed, zones of occupation hardened into borders. What was temporary became routine. What was negotiated became enforced. In Berlin itself, the divisions were immediate. Sectors were defined. Movement was restricted. Cooperation existed, but only formally. Every checkpoint was a reminder that the city was no longer unified. The silence before Berlin had produced a louder outcome. In Washington, planners began to reassess. Intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet intentions differed sharply from Allied assumptions. Ideological control was replacing wartime necessity. But options were limited. The leverage that might have existed if American forces had arrived first was gone. The moral authority of sacrifice belonged to the Soviets. The battlefield outcome supported their claims. This was precisely what Patton had feared. He became increasingly isolated. His statements were seen as disruptive. His willingness to speak plainly was no longer tolerated in a peacetime structure. In October 1945, Patton died in a car accident. The event was sudden. The impact was quiet. His warnings faded into memory. Eisenhower continued to manage the transition. He supported the occupation policy. He emphasized reconstruction. He urged restraint. His view was widely respected. History did not immediately challenge it. But by 1946, the cracks widened. Churchill spoke of an iron curtain. American policy shifted toward containment. The Cold War began to take shape. The lines drawn at the end of the war became permanent fronts. Berlin became the most visible symbol of this division. A city taken by one army, governed by four powers, and split by ideology. The cost of April's decision became clearer with time. The halt of Patton did not prevent conflict. It postponed it. The silence did not preserve unity. It delayed confrontation until conditions were worse. Eisenhower's logic was sound for 1945. It was not designed for 1950. This was not a failure. It was a limitation. Coalition warfare rewarded compromise. It punished foresight that could not be acted upon. Patton's instinct was aggressive, but not irrational. He understood power shifts intuitively. He believed that momentum mattered beyond surrender dates. Eisenhower understood responsibility. He believed that control mattered more than conquest. Both were right within their frames. But history did not judge frames. It judged outcomes. Berlin became the epicenter of Cold War tension. Airlifts, blockades, walls, each traced back to who stood where in April 1945. The pause that seemed cautious became permanent geography. The decision that avoided Allied conflict created a divided Europe. The soldiers who stopped advancing never knew what they had been held back from. The civilians who lived under new regimes never knew how close alternatives once were. No medals were given for restraint. No citations were written for silence. Yet that silence shaped the world more than many battles. Eisenhower went on to become president. He warned of military power unchecked by political wisdom. Patton became a symbol of unfiltered military truth, admired by some, dismissed by others. Between them lay a moment in early April 1945. A moment when tanks were ready, roads were open, and decisions were made far from the front. The war ended as agreed. The peace did not. The halt before Berlin was not remembered as a defeat. It was remembered as alignment. And alignment came with a price, not paid immediately, but paid for decades. If this moment in April 1945 changed how you see the end of the war, do not let the story stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more deep, documented military history where decisions matter more than battles. Like the video if you believe strategy shapes the world longer than gunfire. And leave a comment with one word: choice or mistake, how history should remember the halt before Berlin.